the first talk of the second session, and it's going to be The Hill We Must Die On. So over to you guys.
Thanks. Great. Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for coming here. The title of this talk is A Hill We Must Die On, Cryptographers and Congress. Who are we? I'm Gabe Kapchuk. I'm a fourth-year PhD student at Johns Hopkins, and I'm co-advised by Avi Rubin and Matt Green, and I am an American, which is important for the context of this talk.
And I'm Sean Anconi. I'm a fifth-year PhD student at Penn, also in cryptography, advised by Nadia Henninger and Jonathan Smith, and I'm actually Australian, which is interesting for today's talk. And we work together in Senator Ron Wyden's personal office in Washington, D.C. He's a U.S. federal senator. He's a Democrat and from Oregon. Neither of us had prior political experience or really much policy experience before going into our summer experience, but both of us come from research groups that do have interests in policy, even while they're actually dedicated to the technical work rather than to the policy side.
So before we get into the meat of the talk itself, I wanted to make sure that we kind of set some parameters in terms of what this talk will be and what it will not be. First of all, this talk is going to be very different than the ones in the preceding group. You're not going to see any key exchange diagrams here. This is not going to be an advertisement for a particular set of political views. We did both work in a Democratic office, but we're going to try and make this sort of broad enough that everybody can take away the best way to advocate for the cryptographic community, no matter what your personal beliefs are. This is not going to be a talk about the merits and evils of exceptional access mechanisms. I know we could all talk about that all day, but we really want to keep this sort of away from the hot button issues and talk about the best way to sort of approach the process of interacting with government. Similarly, this is not going to be a US civics lecture, so don't worry, you don't get to take a nap quite yet. We want to make sure that everybody in the room is able to take something away and bring it back to their home country, even if it's not the United States. Obviously, the context that we worked in is very US-centric, and so we're going to be using that for a lot of examples, but the takeaways themselves are sort of broader than that and can be applied to virtually any country. And lastly, this talk is not a view into what's secretly happening in the Senate. We can't tell you all the things that we did, which is a fun thing to say, but we are going to be able to sort of give you the flavor of the things that we worked on and give you an insight into how things work within the federal government. This talk is, finally, two perspectives on what we learned from our summer on Capitol Hill.
So what motivated our desire to go into policy, and what is one of the things that maybe should motivate you? So we have this nice pull quote from Philip Rogaway's paper on the moral nature of cryptographic work, and he's essentially saying that cryptography and power are inextricably intertwined. Cryptography is an inherently political tool, and thus it should be a relevant consideration for all of us to think about the implications of what our work produces in a broader policy and political context. So why work in policy otherwise? So governments struggle with complex systems. I'm sure many of you saw the Facebook hearings, and our elected officials in the US were manifestly unable to grapple with some of the complex issues that are now forefront in the minds of many individuals both in America and around the world. Governments also set trends, so not just in America, but governments set standards that are often adopted by industry, and so the ramifications are broader than just laws and regulations that may be set that impact our technical lives as well as our everyday lives. And also the loudest voices that control a lot of policy debates today aren't technical voices, and in the case of cryptography, there are very few voices from our community that make themselves heard when it comes to discussions in Capitol Hill outside of the one or two hot button issues that everyone is used to talking about. And finally, working in policy gives you a chance to really magnify the impact of your technical work. So while our research papers are broadly disseminated within the community and shape industry, working in policy gives us a chance to magnify our impact through advising lawmakers and policy setters on different ways that research advances can shape their understandings and present both costs and opportunities to the broader community. So a little taste of US civics for those of you who aren't familiar, so that we can help give you some perspective on what we were doing. So the United States government is broadly divided up into 3 different branches enumerated in the Constitution. And the kind of core concept here is the idea of checks and balances. Each of these branches is going to have powers that impact the others and work together to provide a way of making sure that there's no overreach in terms of power. So 2 of the branches that we'll start with, the judicial branch, which interprets the laws and applies laws to cases, and the executive branch, which actually executes the laws. So this would be things like all your government agencies, the IRS, Customs and Border Control, NIST is part of the executive branch, which some of you may be familiar with. And we would love to give you a live demo of calling up the executive branch and showing how to work in policy, but unfortunately they don't seem to be in the office at the moment. So maybe we'll give a pass on that one. And the third branch, which is the one where we worked, is the legislative branch. So the legislative branch is most commonly known for making and writing laws and passing them. Many US school children are familiar with this little cartoon bill, which passes through the legislative process and is made into a law by Congress. However, the other really important function of the legislative branch that many people often overlook is the oversight function. So Congress is tasked with overseeing the other 2 branches and has various powers that enable this oversight function, such as the ability to requisition documents and issue subpoenas and hold public hearings in order to perform investigative and oversight functions that ensure the other 2 branches are doing what they say they are doing. And finally, we worked in a Senate office, a personal office of a senator. So this is the senator chooses which staff members he's going to hire, he or she. Each of these staffers are divided up into issue areas. The particular staffers that control a policy area are known as legislative aides, and we worked underneath one of those. The staff will identify problems and issues and suggest to the senator what stances he or she should take. And they derive the set of issues. They identify issues often through the media, through consultation with experts that they happen to know, with lobbyists who come in advocating for particular positions, and constituent concerns that are forwarded to the office.
So going into the summer, both of us wanted to have some goals set for ourselves, and I think we've sort of laid out a short list of goals that we had that sort of contextualize some of the lessons we were able to learn as we left our summer experience. So first of all, what are the ground rules for doing work in government? As both PhD students, we're very familiar with sort of the academic ground rules, trying to evaluate the value of a citation, for instance, is something that we can kind of get on board with. But trying to understand how you push issues around, how do you talk to people, and really what are the rules in which people are able to do work in the legislative branch was something we both wanted to come away with. Secondly, can 2 people make a substantive impact at all? So we were 2 people working at the fellow level, sort of, unpaid people, and we wanted to gauge how much actual impact we could have, both in our community, but also sort of in the general legislative process. A very key takeaway is, was there any overlap between academically interesting problems and policy interesting problems? And I think this is oftentimes where we see a breakdown where members of our community are not super willing to jump into the political sphere because they don't necessarily see the same issues as interesting, right? And so trying to find an overlap there so we can really sink our teeth into the issues that the political arena is interested in. And finally, how can we best represent our community, right? What steps can we take in terms of teaching each other and learning on our own such that we can best represent the cryptographic community when it comes to a political stage? So what did we actually do? Well, this is what our parents thought we did. They thought we kind of just walked around the hill and took nice pictures and got to see all kinds of famous people walking around. Unfortunately, there was work to be done, so we had to do more than just that. What did our managers actually think we do? Well, as I said before, we can't tell you all the secret things, but this is kind of coming into overlapping interests, right? Are there interests that are similar between our work and what the Ledge branch actually cares about? So we came in kind of caring about the things that I think many people would care about, widespread crypto protocol deployment, right? Stuff like the FIPS standards, Stuff like government CAs and TLS, right? All of us have probably experienced clicking on a DoD website, Department of Defense website, and getting a big warning that says you cannot go here, and trying to figure out why this is. Old and outdated VPN protocols, and sort of making sure that everybody in the government is using stuff that's genuinely and powerfully secure. We also cared a lot about government transparency, which I believe lots of people in this room care about. We're not going to talk a ton about that because I said at the beginning, we're not going to talk too much about some of the hot button issues. What did our senator and their staff care about? They cared a ton about HTTPS and disablement and misconfiguration on agency websites. And notice that this is a widespread crypto protocol, right? So there is some overlap here, though sort of the details of what they cared about are somewhat different. Lack of Start TLS for optimistic email encryption, cared a lot about FPI misrepresenting decryption details around phones and mobile devices. They cared a lot about voting, which we're going to hear a lot more about in just a moment. Notice that there's a lot of overlap between these two groups, but it's not exactly the same, right? So there still are interesting issues that we can work together with. So what did the actual day-to-day look like? Well, we wrote lots and lots of letters. Letters are not necessarily the thing that you think of immediately when you think of the legislative branch. We oftentimes think about legislation. But the way that most congresspersons get their message out is by writing these letters. Some of them are very pleasant letters. You may have noticed that out of the Wyden office over the course of summer, there was a nice little letter encouraging the use of WireGuard and maybe looking at new VPN protocols. I'm not going to say that we were involved in that, but you can make your own conclusions. There was also some angry letters that went out, right? There was a letter that went out from the Wyden office as well when domain fronting, the domain fronting policies were changed at Google and Amazon. That was not the most pleasant letter to read, right? So both this kind of pushing people in industry to take a hard look at what they're doing, but also encouraging people within the government to make good choices. We also had the opportunity to draft some legislation. There was a bill introduced by the Wyden office just after the summer, which had to do with data privacy and changing the way that we think about data privacy in this country. We also conducted cryptographic investigations, which kind of means we just looked around to see where things were broken in the government, which is surprisingly a lot of places. And we got to advise senior staff whenever an issue came into the office that was sort of relevant to data privacy or crypto or something like that. Another really important power was actually getting to meet with people from industry and different government agencies. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And we really, the biggest thing that we did was we argued. We argued a lot. And what's kind of nice is being in an environment where the two of us have similar views on many things, but very different views on other things. And we got to kind of yell at each other and work through these issues in a space where we were encouraged to kind of grapple with the political ramifications of what we were doing. One thing that was really nice is this arguing actually, in my opinion, was really productive. We actually got things done and kind of clarified our issues, which was really relieving. Every once in a while in our field, topics tend to get a little bit heated, and we don't necessarily always get to the bottom of things. Matt Green is my advisor. I cleared this joke. Don't worry, we're all good. A highlight for me and for both of us was actually we got to sit down with a bunch of high-level people from the NSA. One thing that they were able to say is that the officials that sat down across from us thought it was really refreshing to have the opportunity to have a direct conversation with members of the academic cryptographic community, which was a really refreshing thing to hear, and I thought it was actually a really productive meeting. I will say that it's a little bit unnerving that we were the two faces that they saw as representatives of the academic cryptographic community, and so maybe that reflects some of the work we have to do as a community. Beyond that, unfortunately, I'm not able to disclose any of the details of this meeting.
But feel free to buy us drinks later. We still won't disclose any of the details. So a couple of takeaways which we want to give to you from our time there. So number one is crypto is everywhere. This isn't just in crypto standards like FIPS or in places where it's most obvious. A nice example is the Census Department's use of differential privacy for the 2020 census, a really interesting use of cryptography and related techniques. Cryptography also extends to use of a large number of government services as things are increasingly digitized. Things like visa lotteries are controlled by random number generators, which leads to a whole lot of interesting problems in the cryptography space that overlap with government, which we don't always consider.
Lesson number two is that talk is really cheap, but ultimately is very powerful. A lot of politics, particularly in the United States, is kind of performance-based, right? The things that we see our politicians do are very much intended to be seen by the public, right? A good example of this is hearings, right? When you hold a hearing, it's not actually so much for the senators to learn new information from the people who are on the stand, it's for the rest of us to hear the questions and the answers and kind of engage in the political process, right? And so this makes the speech itself really the biggest currency on Capitol Hill. I think there's kind of a big trope that money is the most powerful thing, and after a summer there, that really wasn't true. It was all about your ability to convey an important message and have a conversation. Importantly, politicians actually really do listen. They have the opportunity, that is to say, when they have the opportunity to sit down with a constituent or with an expert, they actually do kind of glean information, and it shapes the way that they see issues. Oftentimes, they don't have the time to sit down with every single person who comes in, so their staff has the opportunity to sit down, and staff are generally a little bit more informed in whatever your issue area is. So for us, sitting down with somebody who's at least familiar with the issues in the encryption or in the crypto space is a much more helpful conversation to have anyway. It's not particularly hard to actually get a meeting. You can kind of call or send a note, and Sean will talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And importantly, the conversations that you have with representatives or with their staff can just be seen as ideas, right? They don't immediately need to lead to action. They can sort of slowly bubble and eventually come up into a law further down the road. There's some sort of guideline to take away when it comes to the media, right? Your member, the representative is not going to read your paper, and they likely won't read your Twitter or whatever your way of spreading your message out into the world is, but their legislative aide actually is very likely to see your work if you're doing a good job sort of publicizing it and making it known. That's a good way to sort of influence the conversation in the office. Some priorities that we have in thinking about the way that speech is regulated. Number one, don't make the member look bad. Number two, make the member look good. Number three, really don't make the member look bad. This was given to us on our first day on the job by the legislative aide we were working with. We kind of like to extrapolate this a little bit and say, don't do bad, do good, and don't do bad.
So lesson number 3, learn to talk like the other kind of nerd, the other kind of wonk. So there aren't really cryptographers wandering the halls of Congress. No one's going to listen to your new SIDH key exchange proposal. But there's still a way to communicate the value and importance of ideas. One way to do this is to think about the mindset through which politicians operate. Because their constituents often don't think in terms of deep subtleties, you've got to think about the way to portray something either as good and contrast that with something that might be bad. So for example, TLS 1.3, good. SSL v2, bad. And so when you are presenting issues to the congressperson, try and present it in a way that they will then A, be able to absorb, and B, be able to communicate to their constituents. Master the art of the concrete ask. So telling the member that, hey, you should really improve your crypto protocol because forward secrecy is really important, probably isn't going to get them going, but saying, government agency X isn't implementing forward secrecy properly, can you please get them to change their configuration in this way to do it? That is something that's much more likely to get done. So here are some examples of easier things to get your member to do and some harder things. I'm not going to go into great detail, but come up and talk to us after about that. So communicating with a member, there are 3 primary channels through which you can do this. Number 1 is call, and if you call and just give an opinion, you're actually going to be put forward in the US to an LC. That's someone who just communicates with constituents. However, you should know that you can ask for the staffer that handles your particular issue area. And this is really the valuable thing, because that's when you can get connected to someone who's going to approach the issue more directly, rather than just taking your one-line good or bad kind of feedback. You can then also ask for a meeting with the staffer who oversees a particular issue, and this is a great chance to get your point across. And then one of the bigger currencies in Congress is the congressional letter, so knowing how to format and write your letters in order to communicate is really powerful.
One kind of boogie word in our community that we try to avoid is this word incremental. You don't ever want to do incremental work, right? But unfortunately, that's not the best way to approach issues when coming to the legislative branch. Big ticket issues, the sexy issues, oftentimes have a lot of enemies, right? And so when you ask a representative, hey, can you take action on issue X? It's unlikely that they'll get much headway done if it's an issue where there's a lot of vested stakeholders, right? And sort of building compromise on these low issues is what's going to get you progress. So some good examples of problems is, hey, we should be using MPC for social good. That's kind of specific, and we're going to be hearing more about that later. Why does the government misconfigure TLS in a certain place, right? And the industry standards for some particular phone protocol, whatever it is broken, and it's affecting a population, right? So there's a real impact at a very narrow scope. It's much harder to go, don't backdoor our crypto. There's a lot of stakeholders there, and people are going to get angry. I'm not going to talk any more about that.
So finally, what can you do? So if you're an academic, as many people here are, embrace the political and moral nature of your work. Find a way to tell the stories about how your work is going to impact other people, and use that to shape the policy narrative. Consider doing some work for your legislative branch. That might be helping out on a letter, or it might be helping out with some legislation, or even sending 2 of your students to work on the Hill for a summer. And be active in learning how to talk about your work non-technically. If you're in industry, again, many of these same skills are applicable. Reach beyond perhaps your particular narrow field and bring in a broader consensus that you can then present to a legislative body to present really good ideas on how government can help improve the state of cryptography. And again, tell the same stories about how what you're doing can improve privacy and security for a member's constituents. And finally, if you are a concerned human, please, like everyone else has always been telling you, take part in your political process and be active. Reach out to either of us if you have any more questions or thoughts. Thank you to our sponsors for the summer, and thank you to Senator Wyden and his staff and the other fellows for facilitating our summer. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have time for one or two quick questions. I've got a question. So these NSA people, they've never talked to an academic before. Haven't they heard of a telephone?
I actually can't tell you what was said in the meeting. We might have asked them about telephones, but I can't tell you about this.
No. Okay, any other questions? Okay, let's thank the speakers again, and let's move on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hopefully it works straight away. I'll signal when it's like a few minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
I tested it.
Good, okay, we're almost there. So apparently, crypto means cryptography. So I hand over to Matt.
Okay, so thanks. So that last talk, I just have some news. That last talk was so persuasive. I've decided to quit my job as an engineering professor and join the faculty at the Georgetown Law School and focus on technology and policy. So thanks. I have a huge change in my life, but it's, you guys, that was a great talk. So I'm glad I got in ahead of the game on running to do policy work, at least part of the time. So this talk is going to be about the role of cryptography and elections and voting. And it's very short. There really isn't, so thank you very much. I'm going to talk a little bit about why. So this is basically to convince you that elections are a really important problem for us to be working on, but maybe not in some of the ways that we've traditionally been working on them as a community. So the role of technology in elections has a very long history, and I'm going to apologize that this is going to be a very US-centric talk, but a lot of the things are applicable in other parts of the world as well, and some of the problems are really fundamental to democratic elections and the democratic process. So, in fact, early elections in the United States were pretty informal in the way they were conducted. They consisted of little more than getting people together in the town town hall and having them raise their hands about who their candidates were. The problem with that, the reason we don't really do that today for big public civil elections, is that it doesn't scale well. And so technological mechanisms have increasingly been used. And these technological mechanisms quietly have properties, some of them security properties, some of them good, some of them bad, that we've kind of taken to become requirements. And one of the examples of that is the secrecy. You can't find out how someone else voted. And in fact, you can't even prove that you voted in a particular way. And that's regarded as a really important requirement. And we've evolved the technology that we use in elections. Earliest in the United States was probably the use of paper ballots. Fill out your ballot form, put it into a box, and at the end of the day, we've watched the box carefully, and then we watch everybody take the ballots out and count them. And that gives us confidence that every vote that was put in the box ultimately gets counted, but we don't actually tie who voted to a particular ballot once it's come out of the box. And so that has some very interesting security and privacy properties that have really become fundamental to how we think about requirements for a democratic election. We've moved on to machine-counted ballots of various kinds, partly because we want results quickly and accurately, and sometimes we achieve that, and sometimes we don't. We've moved on to machine-cast ballots, lever voting machines that were used in some places, and punch card ballot machines, and I'll talk about those in a little bit, electromechanical voting mechanisms. And then finally, and this is really a 21st century, or largely a 21st century phenomenon, voting computers, using computers to actually cast your ballot. And ultimately, public confidence in the integrity of our elections and in who our elected officials are, our belief in the outcome of elections as something we rely on, is now traceable in an increasingly strong way to our confidence in the underlying technology of the election itself. And so the technology issues have become really important as a building block of our democracy. So we should think a lot about what the requirements are and whether our systems achieve those requirements. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these requirements. I will say I've been working in computer security and cryptography and that kind of stuff for 25, 30 years now, and I have yet to encounter a problem nearly as difficult as voting in civil elections. It's the hardest practical real-world problem I've ever seen, and I think there are fundamental reasons for this. I'm going to focus on two of them. One is that some of the requirements are in conflict with each other, and a big one is the secrecy requirement. I can't find out how anyone else voted, and in fact, I can't even prove that I voted a particular way, and that protects me against being coerced to vote in a particular way, because I just have no way of showing that I voted one way or another. But I also want confidence that my vote actually was counted at the end of the day. So we have this strong requirement for auditability and a strong requirement for kind of a lack of auditability at the same time. And this is, we care about both of these things very much, but ultimately when you make that a technical requirement, it seems like it's really hard to achieve both of these things. And the second problem, which is even harder than the contradictory requirements, is that ultimately, particularly in the United States, it's insufficient to merely detect that there was an election irregularity. It's almost impossible to have a do-over election. If you discover that the integrity of the election has been compromised, then what? Do you hold a do-over election? Well, there may not be legal mechanisms to do that. It's extraordinarily difficult in the United States to do that, and it's unclear that it would even be fair to do that under most circumstances, because how do you make sure that everybody who took the time to vote the first time is able to vote the second time, and so on. And so mechanisms that merely say, aha, well, this cryptographic hash will be different from the ultimate outcome, and that shows that there was some tampering, are incredibly unsatisfying in the context of actual real-world elections. We want recovery and find out what the true outcome was. At the same time, we have incredibly high stakes for elections in the United States. We spend much more money on political campaigns, trying to influence who votes, to convince people to vote one way or another, than we actually spend conducting the election mechanics itself. And there is a long history of mischief, almost always at the local level. Elections for mayor or dog catcher or city council are actually historically much more prone to somebody trying to sell the office than large national offices. The traditional threat model has been to prevent a corrupt candidate or a corrupt candidate's supporters from being able to influence the election. In 2016, we had put into focus very clearly that that's not the entire threat model, that the threat model is larger than that and includes very definitely state actors that may want to either influence the election or do something that may actually be easier than influencing the election, which is merely disrupting an election or reducing our confidence in the outcome. And so state actors have the two inherent advantages here. First, they have resources that are likely to be greater than any candidate and greater than any local election board is going to have, and also have an easier task. They don't necessarily need to pick the winner. All they need to do is reduce our confidence in who the winner is. And that is really a great advantage to the adversary and a real difficult problem for the defender. So let's look at the question of whether new voting technology is going to enable some of this kinds of mischief or prevent some of this kind of mischief. And the answer is yes, it does. Elections in the United States, first of all, we have a very highly distributed hierarchy of how elections are conducted. The federal government really sets very broad standards for things like, well, people are allowed to vote. And here's the age for voting, and you get to vote in your state, and so on. But all of the details are left to the states in practice. And part of the reason for that is the constitutional principle called federalism, and there are also practical reasons that that's simply where the mechanisms are. Each state has its own set of laws and rules and practices for the specifics of this, administered in almost every case by an official, usually called the Secretary of State of the state. Elections, though, are in almost all of these states run by the individual counties. That's the most typical granularity for who is actually going to buy the voting machines and count the ballots and get the voters to actually vote. In most states, that's going to be your local county that does that. There are 3,000 counties in the United States, roughly. So that means really we have 3,000 or so election administrators by that count. And in fact, the number is more because in some places they're not counties and in some places they're subdivided under the counties. So the number is really closer to about 5,000 different political entities that control elections in the country. And they have very different capabilities. Some of them are, have a single IT administrator for the entire county who's worried about things like, property tax assessments, as well as, maintaining the voter registration lists in that county and protecting those information systems. Others are going to be more sophisticated than that. So it's very highly variable. 50 different sets of rules for the different states, plus territories and the District of Columbia. then you have all these individual offices who are administering it. On top of that, elections in the United States are the most complex of any democracy on earth. That is to say, we vote for more things than on a particular ballot on election day than just about anyone else. So our ballots tend to be longer. Here we're in California. You notice that not only do you vote for particular offices, and there are going to be a lot of those in any election, but you also have ballot initiatives and bond issues and so on. So we may be asked to make 20 or 30 decisions on a ballot in the United States, not merely check off the box for who you want to be your representative. In fact, there may be different ballots even within a polling place, depending on where someone lives. Things like school board elections and so on may have multiple different ballots depending on the precise residence of the particular voter. So it's very, very logistically complicated, which is to say that the answer, well, just don't use computers at all, is likely not to be a practical solution. Computers have a role to play here, and the question is, how do we get the benefits of computing without the risks of inherent in computing? Here's a picture that the older members of the audience may recognize. Does anybody remember this? It was a while ago. This is a picture of the Florida recount in the 2000 election. This is one of the recount officials examining a paper ballot. The source of a lot of our troubles can be traced to this particular picture. And it's interesting because I think this picture has changed in meaning over the 18 years since it was taken. Almost 19 years now. This picture originally could be, captioned, "Look at those idiots in Florida and their primitive election technology. We've really got to fix this." And now I think the caption that I would put on this picture is, "Look at the strength of this voting system, where a human being can examine a ballot and learn more about what the voter's intent was." Isn't that an amazing property of the system? That we have this human readable, human recountable thing. And I think that lesson is one that we really need to take away from this. So I'm going to talk briefly about the 2000 presidential election. This was a voting machine used in Florida and other states. This particular one was from Wisconsin, but this is the same model machine that was used in Florida in the 2000 election. And it's called a punch card voting machine. And the interesting thing about this machine is that it does not have any electricity involved except for the light in the voting booth, but it has a memory leak in it. And that memory leak had a really interesting property that it only appeared on very popular elections. So in particular, the way this machine works, and I have one of them right here. So this is stolen from Wisconsin. What the voter does is puts in the paper ballot and then takes this little stylus and punches a hole through where the position on the card associated with their candidate is, takes the card out and puts the card in the ultimate ballot box. The problem with that is the little pieces of cardboard from the ballot, these are ballots, end up having to go somewhere. It punches a hole through the ballot, and because of conservation of matter, that cardboard ends up going somewhere. And where it goes is right behind the position in the little machine where the candidate was. Now, for most elections, that doesn't really matter. But if 4 times as many people show up as the machine is designed to be able to handle, what happens is that you have a buildup of these pieces of cardboard behind the positions associated with the most popular candidates. So by the end of the day, candidates become harder to vote for physically, because it's harder to get the little stylus through the ballot. And what happens is that instead of a nice hole, as we see in the upper right, what you might end up with is just dimpling the piece of cardboard where that candidate is associated. Or you might create a little flap where the candidate's position is. The problem is the way these ballots are read is they're taken and put through an optical reader that casts light through the ballot, and if that piece of cardboard is still obstructing the position, it won't register as a vote. But a human being can look at it and say, oh, well, they tried to clearly in this particular place, but they only dimpled it, and a person can figure that out. The consequence was we didn't know for a while who won the 2000 election. It was a big mess. But it led to a piece of remarkable bipartisanship in Congress called the Help America Vote Act. And that was hurriedly passed, and it basically mandated that we get rid of this old embarrassing technology that didn't involve computers and replace it with accessible voting technology. And basically the effect was it created a huge pile of money for the states to buy new voting machines, but those voting machines mostly didn't exist at the time the money for them was allocated. And so the market rose to the occasion and very hurriedly produced computerized voting terminals for the states to buy to replace all of this old equipment. And the most prominent of the HAVA-compliant voting machines is called a DRE machine, not to be confused with the doctor of the same name, but a direct recording electronic machine. In other words, a computer terminal that records your vote in its memory rather than on paper. And this is an example of a DRE voting machine. This is made by a company called ES&S. It's called an iVotronic, lowercase I, capital V. It's not actually made by Apple, in spite of that. But it's basically a touchscreen computer that has an internal memory that stores the ballot. And this is a typical example of such a machine. It's one that we looked at in my lab at Penn on behalf of the state of Ohio in 2007. The observation here is this is not a voting machine. It's a computer that's running voting applications. It's a specialized computer running software. I'm just going to say one thing about software. Software is bad. We don't really know how to write software, but the correctness of software in this application is critically important. Why? Because it's recording the voter's choice in memory controlled by the software that the voter is voting on. So if that software has a flaw in it that causes the machine to misrecord the vote, there is no way to recover from that. We don't have any way other than what the machine is telling us to find out how somebody voted in that design. Software, as many of us have discovered, we don't have general techniques for determining whether general software is correct. In fact, we can kind of prove that we never will for general software. We can't really test software under all circumstances, and complexity is the enemy of correctness, as we've discovered. Software in election systems is used all over the place. It's used before the election to define ballots. It's used to provision voting machines. It's used to register voters. It's used on election day in voting machines and also in devices that may maintain the role of voters. And it's used post-election for tallying and result reporting and for auditing, as well as for recount. Now, there are potential vulnerabilities across all sorts of places. One, there's the possibility of tampering with results that are recorded in machines, tampering with results that are reported to the county headquarters, tampering with the software that actually records the votes in the first place, tampering with the software that is counting the ballots and reporting out the final tallies, and so on. And then we've got the question of how do we audit the software to ensure that the software that we think is running is the actual software that's running, let alone the question of whether that software is correct. So I'm going to make a humble observation, which is that cryptography doesn't help with most of these problems. In particular, it doesn't help with solving these problems in ways that allow us to recover from errors in good ways. So there are some safeguards to make sure that these machines are in fact working well. The most important is called government certification of the vendors and of the equipment. The machines need to be certified as being correct. Anyone who knows how to certify software as being correct is welcome to step up and do that. I don't know how to do that, but these machines do have to be certified to do this. And there are some other mechanisms that I won't talk about in great detail, except to say that there are really 4 major vendors in the United States of voting equipment, and all of them have had serious questions raised about the security and integrity of the systems that they actually produced. So how secure is computerized voting? Well, as Yogi Berra and later John von Neumann are reputed to have said, in theory and practice are the same. In practice, they're different. So e-voting in theory should be a matter of, basically there should be a line in the software somewhere when you cast a vote for a candidate that says, votes for this candidate equals votes for this candidate plus 1. And if that line is there, then the system is correct. And if it's not, then it's not correct. And theoretically, it should be just a question of grep, for that line. In practice, there are a lot of moving parts here. County election management software, voting machine software and firmware, the communications in the system, and so on, and the huge temporary workforce of people who have access to this. The logistics of elections are amazing. There's some potential attacks, and the first one I'm going to list is the one that the state actor might be interested in, which is denial of service. And how do you prevent the vote from actually taking place? Well, we kind of don't know how to do that. I'll give you an example. A system we were given access to at Penn in 2007, the group that I led, was a system made by ES&S. It's the largest vendor. It had penetration in 43 states. It had never been actually independently looked at outside of the certification process before. A quick summary of what we found was that we could compromise every component of the ES&S system at every stage of the election process. And we could do this in ways with no more access than a voter, in some cases, voting, or a precinct poll worker. Basically, if you can touch it or get near it, you can compromise it. And this is a typical outcome when independent people are able to look at these systems. The various independent reviews that have taken place of these systems have found just a crisis of practical security vulnerabilities. Pretty much every e-voting system that has reached the market has had serious vulnerabilities found in it, and they're all below the standard that we would normally associate with high quality critical systems. So it's tempting to look at that and say, well, let's just find ways to build better software. But in fact, the ultimate problems are architectural. So what should we do? Well, in the short term, the first thing is you can't just say, well, let's not hold elections until we fix this. And as engineers, we might say we're not ready to ship, but that we don't have a choice. There are constitutional reasons that we have elections on particular days, and while we still have a constitution, let's enjoy it. In the shorter term, we kind of need better audits, more procedural controls, be aware of what the vulnerabilities are. In the longer term, we need better architectural models that don't make us as dependent on fundamentally insecure things. And the two components of this that have emerged as the state of the art are first a concept first introduced by Ron Rivest called software independence. And software independence is the property that says the outcome of the election should not be dependent on software itself. That is, if there's a flaw in the software, you can still find out who won the election. I'm paraphrasing something. So build systems that don't have software as a critical component. That's a pretty bold requirement, but in fact it's achievable. with technology that actually exists today off the shelf. And the second is a concept called risk-limiting audits, which is a way of sampling, statistically sampling voting machines by doing a manual recount of their results and comparing it with the reported results in a statistically significant way that will give you confidence that if the software worked on your randomly selected sample after the election, that it was working well in the other places, and you can achieve a very high level of confidence. And this can help you achieve the software independence property in practice with things like optical scan paper ballots, which exist today, and they can be bought. And in fact, many states are switching over and using them. So let me just get to the thing everybody's going to say, which is, but what about the blockchain? The blockchain sounds perfect, right? It's a decentralized, immutable ledger, blah, 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 and isn't that what elections are? And we want to get consensus mechanisms and so on. But first of all, it's worth noting that even though elections are about finding out what the consensus is, the components of an actual conduct of an election legally are hierarchical, right? So we have a designated set of election officials who certify the results. We don't just all kind of get together and say, well, we kind of agree on who won the election. We're really trusting mechanisms and officials to conduct elections and report the outcomes in ways that we can audit. But it's ultimately not a decentralized consensus application. It's telling us what the consensus is, but it's not, but the mechanism itself is defined by a hierarchy that ultimately traces back to the US Constitution. So any solution that says just change the Constitution about how we think about elections is already kind of a non-starter. The second problem is that it's heavily dependent on software integrity. In particular, the question not of what is on the blockchain, but is what's on the blockchain actually what people voted for, which is what the problem that we currently have looks like. So it doesn't actually solve the problem that current systems have, which is that the software used to cast votes may be wrong. It also has serious issues of ballot secrecy, and it really addresses tamper detection, not recovery. What do you do if the blockchain doesn't actually tell you the right answer? Do you throw out some of the votes? Do you do over the election? Well, we're back to the original problem. So everyone just stop with the blockchain stuff already. Okay, so for further reading, let me recommend two things. First of all, the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine just issued a consensus report last year on securing the vote. It is the single best resource on the technical problems in voting that I know of. And the second recommendation is that if you want to get involved with this, where do you start? Start by learning what the problems are. The best way I know of to do that, volunteer to be a poll worker with your local county officials. Sign up to be a poll worker. They need the help. You'll work really hard for a day. You'll learn an awful lot about the nitty-gritty of how elections are done. It is an absolutely great experience, and you get to give out those little I voted stickers to your neighbors, which are heavily coveted. So thanks very much, and I think, do we have time for any questions? Or?
Yeah, we have plenty of time for some questions, and so you're definitely first.
So one spooky outcome of this is potentially that you create an incentive for the voting companies to say, okay, we did it wrong, buy our V2.0, it's better, it's more complicated. How do you counteract that with this kind of kind of harder to comprehend, new is not necessarily better. How do you deal with that messaging asymmetry?
Yeah, so it's really tough. And one of the parts of that problem is that we conduct elections every year. We conduct national elections, every 4 years, and elections for national office every 2 years. And we have to do them. And we also have primary elections. So there's a fundamental practical problem that there's a next election coming up, and we have to conduct it. And no solution that doesn't involve addressing that part of the problem is viable. Now, fortunately, we're in a really unique situation in time, and I'm optimistic, actually, for the first time since I've been working on this, or more optimistic, or less pessimistic. Let's say less pessimistic. The first thing is there is bipartisan, I won't say consensus, but recognition that this is an issue that's worth solving. And there's agreement that we should have systems of high integrity. And this has previously been much more partisan than it is now. I mean, notwithstanding anything about the last election, Russian interference and so on, you will find prominent members of Congress, for example, saying the same things from both sides of the aisle about the need to do this. The second is that the equipment purchased under the Help America Vote Act is now starting to reach the end of its natural life cycle. And so the opportunity to get new stuff is actually increasingly there. So we have both political will and a kind of natural opportunity to be replacing the technology that we have. The technology to do risk-limiting audits in a software-independent way exists. Optical scan, paper ballots, plus the risk-limiting audits. We can do this. So get involved at a local level. Encourage your local county officials to want this. Encourage your Secretary of State to want it. That's probably the best way forward here.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay, over there.
Hello. So I've heard an argument that the mess that's described of the 5,000 legislative units or administrative units doing it and all the different ways of doing it is the best defense for it. It's just so hard to subvert because it's such a mess.
Right.
And that any attempt to make it more efficient inherently makes it more subvertible, and we shouldn't even try.
Yeah,
to what extent do you buy that argument?
Yeah, and it's interesting because that's true probably if you're interested in completely changing the outcome of all the votes in the country. That's a strength. But that's not actually the problem someone trying to subvert an election has. And first of all, most of the actual mischief tends to be about local offices. And if you're a national level adversary, some country, rhyming with Usha, or whatever, you have an interesting job because now you have 5,000 targets, and all you need to do is really pick enough of the weakest of them to cause confidence to go away. So you're not going to necessarily pick the hardest, you're going to pick the weakest. And there's a certain amount of homogeneity in these systems because they're using only a few different vendors. And so it's certainly plausible that a national adversary could cause widespread disruption. And I think the only reason that this hasn't happened, if it hasn't happened, is for lack of trying rather than any inherent problem.
Okay, we just got time for one quick question, so make it very quick.
I think I can be quick. Matt, you alluded to state actors and you said one state actor, or you implied that there's one state actor, but isn't the CIA over the last 50 years the largest interferer in democratic elections
that may be
worldwide?
true, but probably not of U.S. elections. Notwithstanding the Watergate break-in, right? Where there were CIA operatives doing this. If we assume that it's state actors that we're going against, even if you believe that the CIA is secretly trying to pick the president, nothing I said changes, right? We still want mechanisms that are software independent, that are hard to attack, that allow us to get confidence without depending on complex software, and so on and so on.
I guess I'm asking for ways that we can avoid compromising democracy worldwide rather than just
yeah, that is beyond the scope of my talk. Okay.
And with that call to arms for next year, we end the session. Please thank everybody from the session, please. Before you all go, don't get up, because it's really the most important part of the conference is now turning up. And I'm going to hand over to Dan.
Yeah, all right. Thank you, Nigel. Great way to start the morning. Let me just get set up here. Thanks. Okay. Uh-oh. Ah. Yeah, that's not what I had in mind. Let's see if we can do this better. What happened here? Is this better? Boy, okay. I'm not sure what. Let me try a different port. Yeah. Just blink at 60 hertz and we'll be fine. No. No? Okay, one more attempt. We'll get there. Does anybody have another dongle? That seems to be the problem. USB-C to HDMI. Oh, thank you. Well, that's probably the problem.
Here's this perfectly safe, untampered dongle.
All right, thank you. Thank you for making me plug in your hardware into my machine. Please work. Yes. All right. All right. So we can make technology work even in the 21st century, although not for voting. Great. Okay. Well, so after this wonderful morning session, this is actually one of the fun parts of the conference where we get to award the Levchin Prize for Real World Crypto. So just to remind you, the Levchin Prize is awarded once a year at this conference. It's a prize that honors major innovations in real-world cryptography, basically innovations that had a significant impact on the use of cryptography in the real world. Yeah, it's a lot of fun to do, and the selection of winners is always a fantastic task. Okay, so I should say the website for this award is levchinprize.com. And I guess I should mention this throughout the session, that we're always looking for nominations for more winners. So please go to this site. There's a nomination form, and nominate your friends and people you admire who you think should win an award like this. So the prize itself started in 2016. It's named after Max Levchin. You probably know Max Levchin is the founder of PayPal. He's been an enormous supporter and champion of cryptography for many, many years, over 20 years. I guess in 2015 or so, we kind of approached him about creating this prize, and he, without even blinking, said, "Yes, I'll do it right away." And so we said we want to give out 2 awards a year. Each award comes with a $10,000 prize, and Max has actually agreed to fund this prize in perpetuity, so forever. So this prize will go on for many, many years, as long as there's a need for real-world cryptography. Okay, so that's the prize. So we've had a number of winners so far. It's actually, by the way, it's quite a commitment from Max's part, so we're really grateful for everything he's done, and it's wonderful that we can make this happen. Okay, so we've had a number of winners so far. So the first winners were Phil Rogaway and the MyTLS team. Then Maine and Moxie and Trevor Perrin for Signal, and of course the development of AES and other cryptographic primitives. Last year, Hugo Kravchik won the award, and the OpenSSL team won the award for their remarkable work on making SSL and TLS as widely deployed as it is. And so with that, we are ready to announce the winners of the 2019 Levchin Prize winner. Okay, so drum roll. Thank you. Okay, so there are 2 winners. The first winner of the 2019 Levchin Prize. No! Okay, here we go. Is Mihir Belare. So. Here, come up here. Picture time.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. Awesome. All right. So Mihir is a giant in our field. I'm sure you all know Mihir. It was actually kind of hard to distill all of his contributions into a single sentence that we can put on the trophy. But the award is essentially provided for outstanding contributions to the design and analysis of real-world crypto systems, including the development of the random oracle model, modes of operation, HMAC, and models for key exchange. And this is really only a tiny, tiny sliver of everything that Mihir has done for real-world cryptography. So it's really a pleasure, Mihir, to be able to offer this award to you. And I should say the award comes with this beautiful trophy. It's a cryptex, so it's actually this. So the citation is here on the bottom. And then you can kind of figure out it's your challenge to figure out what the secret password is and open up the cryptex and find what's inside. So let me give you, first of all, the award. Yeah, so this is the first part. This is the second part. So that's the cryptex. And then most importantly, I have to not forget to actually give you the actual check. So yeah, so congratulations. And traditionally, the award winners actually get to make a speech, tell the community, kind of put the award in context, tell the community where they see the field going. So the stage is yours, Mihir. Do you really want to plug things in?
No.
Oh, okay, thank you. Hi, yes.
I have no training as a cryptanalyst, so I'll have trouble with that, breaking that thing. It's an honor to be recognized, but particularly by RWC and Max Levchin, and thanks to Max and the steering committee for this. And thanks also to great co-authors over the years, particularly Phil, of course, and also to the great students and postdocs. They're the ones who made everything possible. I'm glad to have been part of the exciting early journey in bridging the gap between theory and real-world cryptography. Those were different times, a smaller community, the sense of doing something important. Now it feels awkward to get an award for things done so long ago. And that leads me to ask what time has done. And what I find with time is that I'm thinking more and more about broader issues in life, where our work fits into the social fabric, how we evolve as people and communities, what is the right definition of success. And so kind of returning to my roots in the humanities, I spend more time reading sociology and philosophy and listening and trying to understand how the world and our minds work. And I spend correspondingly less and less time on cryptography, for which I have to apologize to my students. And as part of this has been an evolution in my thinking of what real world or practical means, and I think we benefit from asking this question more and more. When I started, it was a question of being responsive to industry and implementer needs to address what they call practical problems and what people were looking at and wanting to solve. And now I think that these are much deeper questions, like one needs to ask whose needs one is addressing exactly, and in short, who benefits from the work we do. And this is more complex, but it's important because we live in a world that's fractured and iniquitous. And how much of what we do helps rich corporations get richer? Does it increase or decrease inequity? Who benefits from making things faster or beyond a certain point? The constant search for speed. What sort of people do we become when we cannot wait half a second for a web page to load because TLS is doing a round trip and we cut corners? Is it a good or bad thing if Facebook gets faster? I guess my worry is that these goals are driven more by some entities' financial concerns than having value to our development as people. And I've come to feel over time that what one does in helping others is in the end the greatest reward even for oneself. And excitement and ambition that one can have in an area can die with time, and I've seen that happen unless underlain by some greater sense of purpose and connection. And that's where I feel RWC is important, but that's the community which has come together with a broader, more holistic sense of what science and cryptography are about, and is really trying to make the world a better place. And there are many ways to contribute. Despite my real-world sympathies, I feel I'm still at heart a theoretician, and I feel sometimes the most important thing we can give to others is ideas, and that beauty and depth have social value just like art and inspire people. And that has been a tradition in cryptography that I hope continues. I feel like I'm turning into a rambling old man up here, kind of embarrassed to bring that to you. But if I feel with time I have more questions than clarity, and at least I can take refuge in Shakespeare's adage that above all to thine own self be true. And luckily they don't give me more than 5 minutes to speak to you.
Thank you, Mihir. This is quite thought-provoking, whether cryptography can help to make the world a better place in other areas than just protecting information. All right, fantastic. So with that, as I said, every year there are 2 winners. And so the second winner this year, I have to say, was quite an easy decision. It was kind of an obvious choice to make. And so the second winner of the Levchin Prize for Real-World Cryptography, drum roll, please. Yes, thank you, is Eric Brascola. Come up here, Eric. Pictures. All right. Oh, more pictures? All right, great. So Eric, as you all know, is behind the standardization effort of TLS for many years. And of course this year, thanks to the TLS 1.3 effort, we finally have a fantastic protocol to deploy. So let me read the citation. So this is for sustained contributions to the standardization of security protocols, and most recently the development and standardization of TLS 1.3. So thank you, Eric, for all the work you've been doing. We are extremely in your debt, and I'm really happy that we can give you an award for all this work. So here is your wonderful cryptex. We'll see if you can figure out the secret word to open it. And of course, don't forget the award prize. Okay, let me hand over the mic. All yours.
I'm just glad the check isn't in the cryptex.
Here. I'll show the pictures. This is what the cryptex looks like, your cryptex with the citation.
Awesome.
And the
Thank
rest
you.
is yours.
Thanks, Dan. And thanks, Max and the committee. It's really an honor to be here, be in the company of the previous winners, who I think have done fantastic work. I also want to thank the TLS working group, who really did most of this work, the security research community, who made it actually not suck, and Mozilla for funding the work when I was doing it. The past decade has seen a remarkable increase in the use of encryption on the internet. And this is driven to a great extent by the development of open, interoperable communication security protocols. This allow anybody to build their own implementation that can talk to anybody else's. Standards are a key element in making that possible. First, they allow us to converge on common protocols so that actually works. They also coordinate the needs of multiple stakeholders who have interests and needs that are just too hard for any one person to comprehend. And finally, they help us build something better than any single person could have designed on their own, no matter how smart they were. 1.3 is a great example of this. When we started the 1.3 effort, we had about 20 years of experience with TLS implementations and deployments. There were dozens of papers analyzed in TLS, and we were also able to borrow from other protocols like Quick Crypto. So you might have thought, dot release, easy. Not true. So as soon as we started actually doing anything, we discovered it was just really hard to meet the goals we were trying to set. We found we had problems with the anti-replay mechanism, the ZRTT. We struggled to add key separation because the analyst told us it was really important to be able to do analysis of the protocol, which had been so hard in 1.2. And finally, when we actually went and did deployment, we found that there were a lot of middle boxes which just broke very badly when we tried to run 1.3 through them. And it took us almost a year to get to the point where that worked properly. The final protocol had contributions from over 80 people from the standards community, from implementation community, from the deployment community, and from the research community. And I have a list here. So this is everybody in the acknowledgements of 1.3. If you're on this list, give yourself a round of applause. I see a number of people here. you also, it turns out, have the right to a T-shirt if you haven't gotten one from the TLS chairs. Ask them. One thing that made this possible was this critical feedback loop between the standards community, the implementation community, and the research community. So this let us try out candidate designs quickly, evaluate them for deployment, evaluate them for security, and then roll them into the protocol or not roll them in, as the case may be. When I go back and look at my mailbox from the period when we were doing the development, it's full of emails to people like Hugo Tkaczyk and Karthik Bhargavan saying things like, listen, could you just take a really quick look at this? Or maybe you could run this through Provera. Would that be okay? And people were incredibly generous with their time in doing that. And being able to ask those kinds of questions gave us the confidence to make big changes to the protocol rather than just tinker around the edges as we had previously. Increasingly, there's a consensus in the internet community that in the words of the Mozilla Manifesto, security and privacy on the internet are fundamental, and that encrypting everything all the time is the only way to really protect those needs. Fortunately, many of the companies that control so much of the traffic on the internet are also committed to this vision, and I want to give you two examples of that. First, in 2014, Let's Encrypt was founded by Akamai, Cisco, EFF, University of Michigan, and Mozilla to provide certificates for basically everybody on the internet for free. In the time since then, it now has 50 sponsors or more. It's the biggest CA on the internet, and it's issuing about 1 million certificates a day. And this is what we can do when we all work together. We're also seeing companies moving rapidly to deploy new protocols that are secure by default. They're doing this both because it's better for the users and because we've learned that security and performance, as we thought in the past, don't have to be enemies that can work together. A few examples of this: HTTP2, the new version of HTTP, is only run over TLS essentially. TLS 1.30 round trip lets us send data in essentially the same time as you would have sent with ordinary unencrypted TCP. And finally, the new quick protocols under development, not only A is faster, but B, almost everybody in the wire, including all the metadata, is encrypted to the extent we can make it happen. So hopefully we're going to get all this new tech. And people always ask, doesn't this take forever? When is it actually going to encrypt everything? As a reference point, 5 years after TLS 1.2 was deployed, back in 2013, we were just starting to add it to Chrome and Firefox, and about 11% of servers supported it. We're about 5 months out of the standardization of 1.3. It's already been in Chrome and Firefox for quite some time. I hear it's coming to other browsers soon. It's in about 10% of servers, and I'm told that over half of Facebook traffic is already 1.3. This actually understates how fast things can move when we try. We had TLS 1.3 test versions in the field over a year before we actually published the RFC. This is how we found the middle box problem. Full credit, by the way, to the team at Google who really did a lot of the work here. And the same thing is starting to happen with protocols like QuickOut MLS, where we just start rolling out very early versions. What makes this possible is a combination of better collaboration and better design. In terms of collaboration, protocol development efforts are starting to be run like open source projects. They have GitHub repositories, they have Slack channels where they do coordination, and what this means is that we can roll out versions very quickly, and then when we have to improve them, we just keep rolling out new versions, and the transition to the final version is generally quite easy, at least we hope. Second, the protocols are being designed to enable that kind of version rolling and that kind of extensibility, and we're getting much better at it, so it's much easier to have incremental new versions roll out. Finally, having verification of the feedback from the research community gives us the confidence to make those changes and deploy cryptography at scale rather than waiting forever before we do it. This next slide, my second slide, is actual data from Firefox telemetry and shows the rate at which web pages are loaded over HTTPS. So if you go back 4 years, we're looking at basically 35% HTTPS deployment, and now we're looking at over 75, and over almost 85 in the United States. And we have a 10% bump in the last year. I remember going back 5 years, it felt to a lot of us like encryption was stalled. Like, how do we actually get to have encryption everywhere? But now, actually, we're looking at 100% web encryption, and that's like in sight. So that's an amazing thing for me to feel. Openness and collaboration are the core principles of this conference. And what I want to tell you here is collaboration works. And not only that, it's necessary for any large-scale change. And that's how we're changing the world right now. It's a privilege to be part of that. Thank you.
Well said. This is exactly what Real World Crypto is about. Well said. All right, so thank you all. And again, I want to remind everybody that we're looking for nominations for next year. So go nominate, please. We take the nominations very seriously, and we select from what we get from the community. So with that, thank you all again. We're going to break for lunch now. Lunch is going to be served right outside, and we'll resume again at 2 p.m.